All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to Marketing Your Liberal Arts Degree. My name is John Holtze and I'll be presenting today's webinar. I'm the Assistant Director for Career Development and Career Advisor to students in the College of Arts and Sciences, the Leisure Dean College of Fine Arts, and the School of Communications. I work individually with students in a multitude of career development areas, including today's featured topic. This webinar is brought to you by the Career Planning Development Center at Webster University, a centralized career development office located in St. Louis, Missouri, providing individualized career development support to undergraduate and graduate students across Webster University's network of campuses and online programs. Today's webinar is being recorded. A follow-up email will be sent to attendees by the end of the day tomorrow that will include the presentation materials for our topic and a link to the recording. Those resources will be sent to the email address associated with your Handshake account. Additional information in our post-webinar communication will highlight future Career Planning Development Center events and how to schedule a career advising appointment with your designated career advisor through Handshake. To assist with the sound quality of the webinar, please keep your microphone muted throughout the duration of the event. And if at any point you have questions about the information discussed during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat box to communicate your questions or comments. I'll reserve time at the end of our session to answer any questions that you may have about our topic. So today's webinar topic is Marketing Your Liberal Arts Degree. During this presentation, you'll learn strategies for effectively marketing your liberal arts degree and communicating how your skills and experiences can be an asset to potential employers. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started and take a look at some of the learning objectives for today's session. So by the end of today, I'd like it if you all could learn about different skill types and recognize prominent skills often developed through liberal arts degree programs. There are so many valuable skills that are inherent within a liberal arts degree education. And I think it's first important to distinguish between the different types of skills that we'll be discussing. So we'll be talking about a few different types of skills. So I want to sort of outline and make sure that everyone's aware of the different types of skills up front. And then we'll talk about identifying the specific skills that you've developed. So, developing those skills is one thing, but recognizing those skills is entirely something else. So we'll talk about how you can go about identifying and determining which skills that you have developed. And then uncover strategies to market your skills to employers through application materials and in an interview setting. So, just as recognizing which skills you have is important, being able to effectively communicate those to employers is vital to ensuring that they recognize the full breadth of skills that you have and how they could be useful and an asset to their organization. So I think it's also helpful to first determine what we mean by liberal arts and kind of define what we're talking about. So liberal arts degrees involve a number of different areas and majors, including English, philosophy, history, social sciences, natural sciences, really the humanities in general, among others. And if you want more statistical information and data about humanities related fields and information about career outcomes associated with humanities and liberal arts fields, you can explore the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Humanities Indicators Project, which is a really interesting project that you can explore here. And again, these resources will be sent to you through an email that you'll be receiving by the end of today tomorrow, or by the end of the day tomorrow. So looking at those different skill types, one of them that you may have heard of before is technical skills, also called hard skills. So these are typically more sort of objective skills that don't necessarily require as much of an explanation about how you develop them. So hard skills are teachable skills and abilities that are typically pretty easy to quantify. So hard skills are oftentimes learned in the classroom or through books or training materials or even on the job. Some examples include certifications, software, computer programs, and additional language skills. So again, these that tend to be more objective and simpler to discuss via application materials. So they don't really require as much explanation about how you develop them or how you use them. I'd like to use Microsoft Excel as an example. Typically, if you tell me you're proficient with Microsoft Excel, I have a pretty good understanding of what that means. It really doesn't vary too much from person to person. Sure, there are levels to knowledge within that, but if in general you tell me that you're proficient with Microsoft Excel, I kind of know what that means. Soft skills, on the other hand, tend to be a bit more subjective. They are also, a bit more difficult to quantify and really kind of involve the way you interact with other people and sort of those interpersonal interactions. So some examples include leadership, teamwork, written communication, and verbal communication skills. And when I say they're more subjective, by that I mean unlike Microsoft Excel, which I kind of have that understanding of what that means. If you tell me that you have, leadership skills or teamwork skills, that may vary from person to person and may require a bit more context to fully understand what your experience within that skill set involves and how you've applied it in the past. And then looking at transferable skills, they're very similar to soft skills. So transferable skills are the skills that you acquire and transfer to future employment settings. So you can think of these as sort of universal skill sets that are desirable among a number of different career fields, no matter what that is. So some examples include interpersonal communication, problem-solving skills, time management, critical thinking, and organizational skills. So you may be thinking the soft skills and transferable skills, they seem very similar, and you'd be right. They do really overlap in a number of different ways, and they are a bit different when it comes time to kind of discuss those skills than those technical skills or hard skills that we covered before. Again, hard skills tend to be more objective, whereas soft skills and transferable skills are more dependent upon situations and more subjective and might require a bit more explanation for how you develop those skills. And what we'll find is that a number of liberal arts degree programs really involve a lot of the soft skill and transferable skill development. So what that means is they're highly important skills. They're essential in a number of different ways, but describing the importance of them and describing your experience with them to employers may require a bit more explanation, may require you to sort of exemplify that experience through examples. So which skills are you developing through your education? So in the liberal arts degree programs, you're developing a number of different transferable skills, soft skills, and also technical skills as well. I want you to take a moment and really explore this list and consider which of these skills you have developed or are currently developing through your education. So if you could review this list, I'll give you about 1 minute to really take a look and identify 3 of these and think about your experience here at Webster or at life in general, and think about which of these skills you are developing. So I'll give you a minute to review this list and jot down those 3 skills starting right now. All right, so we're coming up on about a minute, and I would encourage you to, after this webinar event, to really review this list again in more depth and think about all these different skill sets that you may be developing. I think, spending some time to really brainstorm and think about the vast array of classes you've taken and the different concepts that you've come across through those classes and how you've developed some of these different skills. I think that that would be a helpful thing to do. And then we also have, or you have access to the ONET online skill search. So this is an inventory and a search that you can use to help identify some other skills that you may have developed. And then if you really are struggling to determine which skills you have or which you've developed, you can also meet with your career advisor to have access to a career assessment called Clifton Strengths for Students. And this is a little bit different from skills. This really looks at your strength areas. And it takes an objective look at your self-identified strengths, whether you recognize that you have those strengths or not. So this is kind of provides a common language for you to talk about those strength areas, which really do align in a lot of ways with skill areas as well. So if that's something you're interested in, I would really encourage you to reach out to your career advisor and schedule an appointment and discuss that as an option. So what are we hearing from employers as being notable? Well, every year, the National Association of Colleges and Employers conducts an employer survey to various employers and asks them what they rank as sort of those most critical career competency areas and skills that they look for in new hires. And year after year, critical thinking and problem solving tends to top this list. It has become very evident that employers really value critical thinking skills and problem solving skills. These are other career competency areas that are also highly valued by employers, but really those critical thinking, problem solving skills, as you can see, tops the list, followed by teamwork and collaboration, and then professionalism and work ethic. After that, oral and written communication skills are also identified as being highly valuable in new hires. Same with leadership skills. And then to round out that list, they've got digital technology, career management, and global multicultural fluency. So, what we're hearing from employers is those critical thinking and problem solving skills, teamwork skills, communication skills, and professionalism. Those are really essential for new hires. And so now I think it's important to also look at which of these skills are being developed through a liberal arts education. So I just took a look at some liberal arts degree programs here at Webster that we have. And as you can see, some of the learning outcomes really connect very closely and align very closely with the career competency areas that employers are saying year after year are highly valuable and highly desired in their new hires. So if we look at the philosophy program, upon completion of the program, students will be able to critically analyze arguments. They will be able to explain philosophical concepts and respond to concrete situations and current problems. And then finally, to effectively communicate their ideas. So where have we heard critical analysis and explanation and communication? Well, they are those career competency areas that employers have noted time and time again as being highly relevant and highly important. If we look at the English program, for instance, it notes that graduates leave Webster prepared with the critical thinking and communication skills needed to succeed in whatever career they choose. So again, really looking at those critical thinking skills that employers value and those communication skills that employers value as well. Then if you look at the GCP program areas, they've got global understanding, which really kind of connects with that intercultural competence area. And then the other skill areas being critical thinking, intercultural competence, oral communication, and written communication skills. So again, these all align very clearly with some of those career competency areas that employers highly value and really look for in new hires. And the education within liberal arts degree programs often provide students with those transferable and soft skills that we talked about. Some of those being interpersonal communication skills, as I've mentioned, those critical thinking skills, analytical skills, teamwork skills, and then also problem solving. So the challenge then becomes, how are we going to discuss this? How are we going to communicate those skills effectively to employers to show that you've developed them? Developing them, again, is one thing, but being able to discuss them and show the value to potential employers is an entirely different topic. So some initial considerations when trying to, when seeking to communicate them through application materials are to think about your goal and which specific skills it's going to be helpful to highlight. So again, kind of taking stock of which skills you've developed, which is why I had you review that list to start generating some ideas about those skill areas that you might want to highlight through your application materials. And then provide context to readers regarding how you used and developed those skills. So again, you know, some of these transferable skills and soft skills, it's so important to exemplify them to readers of your resume or your application materials. They might not know the full true value in your critical thinking skills unless you can provide some examples of how you applied those critical thinking skills in the past. And then it can really help to explore the job description of the position and consider the goal of your application material. So I really can't stress enough the importance of looking at what the job description or the job posting says and analyzing that job description. That's going to provide a number of different clues about what the employer is specifically looking for out of a candidate and a potential new hire. So this is sort of an example of how you might go about analyzing a job description to determine which skills you want to highlight. So, you know, going through, I'll actually physically print off a copy and take a highlighter and go through line by line, just as this example shows, and see, you know, which specific technical skills. In this case, you can see that the research assistant position lists Microsoft Excel. That's one of those technical skills that they mentioned, but then also which transferable and soft skills are involved. So under the qualifications, you can see oral and written communication skills, accuracy and attention to detail, statistical knowledge. So really look at the job description and try to identify some patterns. You know, in this case, they're really looking for someone who has the technical knowledge of Microsoft Excel, has the experience to be detail-oriented, data-focused, has that experience working with data sets, and then has communication skills that are going to be applicable. So, you know, depending on the job, this may be radically different, the patterns in the description of qualifications, but really thinking about what patterns exist within the positions of interest that you'll be applying to and which skills you have that you can sort of highlight and connect the dots for the employer is a great way to approach the application process. And then you can also really integrate those into your bullet point statements within your resume. So, you know, as I mentioned with the skills that you develop through liberal arts education, oftentimes they may require more of an explanation of how you use them. And there's no better way to do that in the resume than through your bullet point statements. So it really helps to exemplify those skills that you've developed through your liberal arts education. It gives the reader a background of your skill development and really gives them a better understanding of how you've applied those skills in the past. So if we take a look at this example as, you know, a community caseworker at a behavioral health clinic or behavioral health service provider, let's take a look at some of these bullet point statements. So assisted clients with overcoming challenges experienced in daily living activities by utilizing problem-solving skills to develop timely solutions. So here we notice they are utilizing problem-solving skills. They are developing solutions using those problem-solving skills. They explicitly identify problem-solving as a skill area. So, you know, compared to if you were to include problem solving as a standalone skill within a skill section, for instance, that's not going to give them a whole lot of information about how you did that. In your bullet point statements, however, it becomes very clear how you use those problem solving skills. And this gives the employer an understanding of how you could apply those skills that you've developed in this situation to other situations to help their organization. This next bullet point statement, analyze client intake forms to develop practical, logical solutions and effective treatment plans. Again, really highlighting those analytical skills, those problem solving and logistical skills about coming up with solutions for effective treatment plans. So again, this really walks the reader through understanding how those skill sets have come to be beneficial in this employment setting and potentially in their organization as well. This next one, organized and led sustainability committee, forming and implementing ideas to reduce waste and increase case management efficiency with team of committee members. So there's a lot in here that an employer can determine the value of your education experiences and the skills that you develop. So organizing and leading a sustainability committee, I mean, that shows initiative that you organized it. Leading that sustainability committee obviously shows those leadership skills. And then working with a team of committee members shows those team-based skills that you may have developed as well. And then finally, utilize effective communication skills to thoroughly document progress through case notes and deliver and compose professional responses to inquiries via phone and email. So in here, again, chock full of those skills. Communication skills are directly highlighted. Rather than simply saying in a skills section, I have communication skills, which may, an employer will just have to take you at your word. This specifically mentions how those communication skills have been developed. And then those composing professional responses really shows the professional communication skills that employers tend to value as well. And so some tips and sort of an anatomy of bullet point statement writing. It's best to begin with an action-oriented verb. So if you'll notice with these examples, assisted, analyzed, organized, utilized, these are action-focused verbs. These really kind of begin each bullet point statement with a verb and an action that the reader can understand and determine has quite a bit of value. If you are unsure which action verbs you might want to use, we have this list of bullet point action verbs that the CPDC put together, and they're broken down into different categories. So there's a ton of different action verbs that you can look at to get some ideas of ways that you might want to communicate your experience. So after the action verb, it is helpful to include what you did, how you did it, and why it was beneficial. This is sort of a framework you can apply to bullet point statement writing and to include those skills that you've developed through your liberal arts education. What you did, kind of a little overview, how you did it, really looking at those actions that you took. That's going to be valuable to employers, is figuring out which actions you took and how you, sort of the process behind what you did. And then why it was beneficial, why those actions and why that process ended up yielding a positive outcome. Again, really walk the reader through that process. That's going to give them the most indication of how you use those skills, what that process looked like, and how you could apply them at their company or their organization. So now I want you to think back to those 3 skills that you wrote down before when you reviewed that list. And I want you to take a moment and think about, given these bullet point examples and given this bullet point construction anatomy, how could you maybe form some of those skills into bullet point statements? They may all be from different situations that you develop those skills, but how would you maybe talk about those skills by integrating them into what you did, how you did it, and why? And so I'll let you think about that for just a moment. And again, if this can be a process, determining the best way to communicate these skills, and it can take some teamwork to come up with some of the best solutions. So I would encourage you to reach out to your career advisor to help with developing some bullet point statements. And then a lot of times students may be under the impression that, if you weren't necessarily paid for an experience, then it doesn't belong in your resume, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I really think about your resume as building a case for why you are the best candidate and thinking broadly about what that may encompass. A lot of times, it involves your academic experience. So with that example before, you may be thinking, well, sure, you can develop these great bullet point statements if you've had a role as a community support worker, but if you haven't, what am I supposed to talk about? Well, your education is rich with different skills that you've developed and also implemented before too. So in this example, including an academic experience section can be very useful for highlighting those skills that you've developed. Maybe you've been a part of a conference presentation before. So like in this one, the undergraduate philosophy conference presentation on stem cell innovations and current issues in bioethics, excuse me. And so, this one, they use just a couple bullet point statements to talk about the value inherent within that experience. They conducted research and derived or created a 25-page research paper. And then they specifically mentioned that they presented to an audience of over 75 people. And then again, well, I didn't mention this before, but sometimes quantifying your bullet point statements can be helpful. So a 25-page research paper tells me exactly how many pages that is, rather than just saying a paper in which I won't understand the depth or the breadth of what that encompasses or how substantial it is. And then an audience of over 75 people. If I simply say an audience of people, that could be 3 people, that could be 100 people, but 75 people tells me it's a fairly large audience. And then hosted research findings, Q&A session, fielding questions from conference attendees. That tells me a lot of information too, that those communication skills, those presentation skills, those critical thinking skills, and thinking quickly on your feet to answer some of those questions, all of those ideas are inherent within this description. And again, this isn't necessarily a career that someone has already embarked upon. This is just an academic experience that they've had through their experience at their college. So I think it's really helpful to think about the different areas that may fall under. So maybe that's academic papers, maybe that's larger projects, really thinking about the academic experience you've had can be helpful for determining what you might want to talk about in an academic experience section. And then also if you've saved old class syllabi, sometimes that helps to review those and think, what are some of those major projects I've worked on and how could I maybe talk about those to employers in a way that would demonstrate the value of the skills that I've developed through completion of those projects. And then I kind of touched on this before, but a skills section can be another great way to showcase those skills to an employer. Typically, I recommend going with technical skills here. Again, those transferable or soft skills, which are essential and really important to employers, are great, but they're better suited for situations where you can really talk about how you use them, such as bullet point statements. Technical skills are great for a skill section. The ones that don't require that much explanation are more sort of objective in nature, like computer programs, certifications, language skills, and things like that. And then finally, portfolios or writing samples can be really useful for kind of letting your work speak for itself. So especially in some of the more creatively based fields, having some work that shows, the work that you've done, the work that you've produced really helps show the employer what it is that you've created before. And ultimately, all of this is done so that they can have a good understanding of what you might be able to contribute to their organization. So, if you find that having some writing samples or having some different pieces of work that really speak well to the quality of your work, compile those, create some sort of portfolio, whether that be digital or like a tangible portfolio as well. So that's kind of the application material side of it. You can also communicate your skills in interview settings pretty easily as well. So before the interview begins, though, consider different examples you may want to cite if you are asked about different aspects of your experience and your skills. So really, the best way to prepare for interviews is to try to anticipate what types of questions they may ask and really already have some sort of framework for responses created. So, there are some universal questions that you may get that kind of tell me about yourself, introductory question. You'll probably be asked at the end, what questions you have for me. I always take that opportunity to ask some questions that demonstrate an interest in that company. And then some of them, as time goes on, more and more employers are using what are called behaviorally based questions. And these are questions that ask about specific situations you've experienced before in the past. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but some interviewing tips to begin is really study the job description, just as we analyzed the job description before, but that will identify topics or questions that may be asked. And then consider the skills and experience that you've gained from your liberal arts education and prepare responses ahead of time. Think about examples that you can maybe cite or ways that you could talk about those skills that you've developed that really paints a picture for the employer and shows and demonstrates that value. Yeah, so think about the diverse skill sets you've developed, really take stock of those and provide those examples to help them understand how you could apply those skills to their organization. So, if an interviewer asks you, tell me about a time you had to solve a problem quickly, or tell me about a time you had to communicate a complex idea to a coworker or to a stakeholder. Have some idea about what you might want to respond with and how you might kind of effectively talk about those skills that you've developed in answering these different questions. Fortunately, there is a technique that you can apply that really touches on all of the aspects needed to formulate a thorough response that's going to be effective and going to provide a clear understanding to the listener about what it is that you've done. So those behavioral-based interview questions I asked or mentioned before really are used to get a feel for your past behavior as a predictor for future behavior. So how you've responded in the past is going to tell them a lot about how you might respond to a similar situation in the future. And this is a great time to really expand on and describe how you develop those skills through your liberal arts education. And the STAR technique stands for situation, task, action, and results. So the situation, it's helpful to give like a sentence or two background, just kind of providing context, setting the stage for the listener, for them to understand the situation. Where did it happen? What was going on? When did it happen? These types of things to just sort of set the stage. The task really involves what was that challenge that you were up against? What was that situation that occurred or that problem that occurred that forced you to take some action? And then the action and the results are two aspects that you really want to focus on. These are what the employers are really going to want to know about is what actions did you take? How did you overcome that challenge that you were up against? What tools did you use? What did that process look like? What is it that you did? And then the results. So what was the ideally positive response or positive effect of those actions? Hopefully it was a positive response. If not, you could always talk about what you learned from that experience or what you might do differently next time. But so that situation, a context, a brief overview of the situation, the task, what was that challenge you were up against? The action, what was the action that you took to overcome that challenge? What interventions did you put in place? And then the results, what was the positive result from those actions? So you can see here, there's a couple of examples of putting that into practice. So situation, I volunteered for a political campaign under a staff member who was in charge of field organization and outreach. He wound up having to leave the job early for a family medical emergency. So just a couple sentences that sets the stage for the listener, that gives them an understanding of what was going on. The task, the remaining team needed to immediately go into crisis mode and then divide his responsibilities to make sure that the campaign continued to run efficiently. So that was that task. They immediately needed to switch things up and delegate tasks to other people and divide those responsibilities. So then the action and the results are the heart of the response. So I asked to take on field organization because I felt that it needed more focus than it had when it had been combined with social media and outreach under the previous staff member's role. So that actions that they took. The results, I was hired to the campaign and wound up expanding field organization efforts. Overall, our decisions to divide labor made the campaign more organized since we focus on specialization. So this provides a great example of what that might look like in the whole STAR technique from start to finish. So it includes all of those components that might be helpful. So the question for that might have been, tell me about a time where you had to think quickly or act as part of a team to quickly solve a problem, and that would be the response. Here's another STAR technique example. I won't read it verbatim. You can take a look at that on your own time, but I would encourage you to really think about, what are some skills that you could talk about and how could you apply the STAR technique to exemplify those skills to employers in an interview setting. Again, speaking with your career advisor is a great way to do that as well. So now moving forward, what I recommend to do in the near future is really spend some time and take an inventory of the skills that you developed through your education. So brainstorm, create a running list of those skills that you've developed. It may not be apparent. I know it's difficult to sort of look at it from some perspective other than your own. Sometimes we don't recognize the skills that we're developing through our education. That might be apparent to someone else. So you can always ask other people, whether your teachers or family members or fellow classmates or people like that, and really think about those skills that you're developing that might not be apparent to you. Then also you can review some of those resources that I highlighted earlier too. And then explore strategies for integrating your skills in your application materials through bullet point writing, a skill section, infusing academic projects or other sections in your resume. These are all good ways to really talk about those skills that you've developed and demonstrate them to employers. Something I didn't even touch on today is cover letter writing, but that's another great way to really go in depth and talk about how you've applied those skills. A second paragraph of your cover letter is a great place to really connect the dots for the employer. And, if they specifically mention critical thinking skills or analytical skills or whatever it may be, that's a time for you to really talk about, in my experience at such and such class at Webster University, I developed this project where I use critical thinking skills. You can make it sound cohesive and nice and explain it in a really polished way. And for assistance with that, definitely connect with your career advisor. We're more than happy to do that with you and to figure out the most effective way to communicate those skills. And then consider creating a portfolio or a collection of writing samples that you could share with a potential employer. Really being able to let the work speak for itself, but then also being prepared to speak about how you created that work is very helpful. And then before you submit your application materials, really look at the position description. Look for those key themes that they're citing as being important, and make sure that you can provide highly relevant information about your candidacy to the potential employer. So, it may sound like a lot of work to kind of customize each resume or each cover letter to a potential position of interest, but it's really, if you're serious about a position, that's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to make it as easy as possible for the employer to quickly scan your application materials and realize that, all of those boxes that they wanted checked, you check them all. You have experience with this, this, and this. You've developed these skills that pertain to that job. So customizing your application materials is really essential. And then to effectively prepare for interviews, consider responses and examples of ways that you've used your skills that you've developed through your liberal arts education. So again, applying that STAR technique, thinking about painting a picture, using all 4 of those components to formulate those responses that can clearly outline all the important elements of that situation and kind of tell a cohesive story to the employer. So that's pretty much what I've got prepared. I would again encourage you to reach out to the CPDC, schedule an appointment with your career advisor. This is information on how to do so. You can call us, email us, set up an appointment on Handshake, whatever is convenient for you. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, you will receive this Spark page with all of the resources, as well as a recording of this program by the end of today, or by the end of the day tomorrow. And at this point, I want to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to include that in the chat. So I'll give you a few moments to compose any questions that you might have that we could answer. See a comment. Thank you for attending. I'm glad that you have found it to be informative. No questions at this time. All right. Well, with that being said, I want to thank you again for attending. Feel free to reach out to your career advisor, set up an appointment with your career advisor, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. And then also, I mentioned at the beginning of the session, you'll be receiving an email with the presentation materials. And our next web event will be Ask Us About Interviewing, which is an interactive Q&A session on April 14th at noon Central Time. So you can find out more information about that session and registration details in the events section of your Handshake account. So we're looking forward to sharing more content with you. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.